I recently wrote an article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Ukraine's Manpower Crisis. No amount of money or aid can solve it. This comes at a time when the United States is claiming there is a political impasse, blocking additional arms and ammunition from being sent to Ukraine, and that is resulting in catastrophe unfolding on the battlefield for Ukraine. But as I pointed out many times before, even if the money was already released, there simply is not enough arms and ammunition being produced by the collective West to send to Ukraine in the quantities necessary to make a difference on the battlefield. In addition to that, there is this growing military manpower crisis. There is no amount of money or aid that can solve it, as the headline suggests, the title of the article suggests. So what I want to do is I want to read this article, then I want to read from a paper written by a U.S. Army officer about standing up entire new brigades, which I think is relevant, looking at how the U.S. is thinking about how they might hypothetically stand up brand new brigades. We can look at that and see how realistic it is for Ukraine to do likewise in the middle of a conflict under less than ideal conditions. So both Ukraine and its Western supporters are raising the alarm over Ukraine's military manpower shortage and the difficult decisions facing the Ukrainian government in resolving it, if it can be resolved. Ukraine's manpower crisis represents a growing problem that no amount of Western financial or military aid can remedy, and may represent a point of weakness nothing short of NATO resignation or intervention can address, meaning either NATO accepts that they have lost this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, or they attempt to intervene directly and turn the tide. Ukrainian publications like the Kyiv Independent, in its article, Ukraine struggles to ramp up mobilization as Russia's war enters third year. That is this article here. Notice the Nazi Wolf's Angle logo in the background. This is Azov recruiting poster. This is the article that I'm referencing. And Western publications like Washington Post. That is this article right here. Frontline Ukrainian infantry units report acute shortage of soldiers. This was written February 2024. These articles explain how a shortage of soldiers is accelerating the strain on Ukraine's remaining forces, compounding their difficulties along the line of contact. The articles also note the difficulty of additional mobilizations, which would require calling up segments of the population previously exempted from military service, and the social and political divisions such a mobilization would create. This is just one of many problems Ukraine faces. With the conflict in Ukraine entering its third year, Ukraine and its Western sponsors are increasingly admitting to shortcomings in terms of their support for Ukraine. This includes shipments of both arms and ammunition. While the collective West media insists these shortcomings are the result of political deadlock in the US Congress over funding, these shortcomings are the result of deeper problems much more difficult to address. A U.S. Department of Defense National Defense Industrial Strategy report not only admits that the U.S. military industrial base is incapable of producing the amount of arms and ammunition Ukraine requires on the battlefield, but that systemic problems will prevent the U.S. from doing so anytime in the foreseeable future. And that is in reference to this. The National Defense Industrial Strategy. You can download it and read it in its entirety. I also wrote a New Eastern Outlook article titled Fatal Flaws Undermine America's Defense Industrial Base, where I summarized this entire report in this article. I also have a video that I did on that topic. The U.S. Department of Defense also recently admitted that it failed to create a sustainment strategy for U.S. weapon systems sent to Ukraine, including the Patriot Air Defense System, the Bradley Infantry Fighting Vehicle, the Stryker Armored Vehicle, and the M1 Abrams main battle tank. Without such a strategy, the press release admitted the Ukrainians would not be capable of maintaining these weapon systems. That is a quote that is from this press release here from the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General, and I've gone over this in previous videos as well. Together, these factors constitute significant obstacles for Ukraine and its Western sponsors as the current conflict grinds on. The additional manpower crisis complicates matters even further. Now let's talk about the problems of building brigades. I described this briefly in the article. I will go into it in depth after I'm done reading the article. Despite recent claims from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky that Ukraine has only lost 31,000 soldiers since February 2022, the New York Times reports U.S. officials placing the number closer to 70,000, and Russia's Ministry of Defense places the number at 444,000. Urgent efforts to mobilize hundreds of thousands of additional soldiers, as reported by Reuters, betrays the true scope of Ukrainian losses. So we can look at this Reuters article. Ukraine considers proposal by army to mobilize another 500,000 for war. Why would you need to mobilize 500,000 additional soldiers if you've only lost 30,000 soldiers in the first place? Why would that ever be necessary? It's very obvious they lost many more soldiers than that. As a matter of fact, looking at the Ukrainian claims, the US claims, and the Russian Ministry of Defense claims, the only number that makes any sense is Russia's number of 444,000. That if you lost that many soldiers, wanting to replace them and an additional 100,000 would make the most sense. Ukraine's losses are so extensive that its problems go far beyond just mobilizing enough soldiers to maintain troop levels along the line of contact. Ukraine must reconstitute entire military units up to the brigade level. Building or rebuilding brigades of around 4,000 soldiers each began in 2022 and continued into 2023 ahead of Ukraine's failed summer-fall offensive. According to Reuters, another Reuters article here, who are the forces involved in Ukraine's counteroffensive? All the details of that is mentioned in that article. Up to 9 brigades were trained and armed by NATO for the offensive, all of them subsequently suffering catastrophic losses. The brigades performed poorly during the 2023 offensive due primarily to the short period of training both individual soldiers received and the short period of time the individual brigades had to train for combined arms operations. And when I explain how the US is thinking about standing up new brigades of its own, you will see how much training is actually required and how if you try to speed that up, how disastrous it becomes. To successfully build a brigade, Ukraine would need to properly train individual soldiers for entry-level positions such as infantry, artillery, armor, and other supporting roles. They would also need to properly train these soldiers as part of the individual units they would be assigned to in order to build unit cohesion. These units would then need to train to work together as a brigade in combined arms warfare, in which infantry, armor, artillery, and other types of units coordinate together on the battlefield. Basic training alone can take 2 to 3 months. Additional training for supporting roles can take anywhere from a few more months to an entire year to complete. Even when this training is complete, newly trained soldiers usually benefit from a period of on-the-job training with experienced soldiers in existing units, led by experienced non-commissioned officers or officers. Another aspect often overlooked is the training and experience required from these NCOs and officers. Their training can take over a year or more to complete, and the experience that makes fire team leaders, as well as platoon, company, battalion, and brigade commanders effective on the battlefield takes even longer to acquire. And we're talking about years and years of experience required to do some of these jobs in terms of leading large units of armed men. It should be remembered that the US, along with the rest of NATO, spent from 2014 to 2022 training tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops at all levels of Ukraine's armed forces, including officer training and brigade-level combined arms training. According to the US Department of Defense, that is according to this here, from May 2022, defense officials hold media brief on the training of Ukrainian military, and they will talk about the training from 2014 to 2022 and then afterwards. While these NATO-trained Ukrainian forces managed to draw out the conflict and raise the cost for Russia of addressing its national security concerns along its border with Ukraine, by doing so, Ukraine itself is paying a much higher cost in terms of economic damage, loss of life, the loss of territory, and the decimation of its armed forces in the process. If the US and the rest of NATO were unable to build forces sufficient to fight and defeat Russian forces under ideal conditions over the course of 8 years, it is unlikely the collective West can do so in the middle of an intense, large-scale conflict that is demonstrably eliminating what trained military manpower and equipment Ukraine has left. Efforts to reconstitute trained military manpower since the beginning of the special military operation have focused on providing thousands of Ukrainian conscripts and volunteers abbreviated training courses across Europe before sending them back to Ukraine to face combat. These abbreviated training courses are incapable of producing properly trained soldiers to fight effectively on the battlefield, leading to greater losses and thus a greater need for additional soldiers. The more soldiers Ukraine needs, the more abbreviated training becomes, the less effective that training is, and the more subsequent losses Ukraine suffers on the battlefield. This constitutes a vicious cycle Ukraine and its Western sponsors are incapable of escaping except through either ending or expanding the conflict. So we come back to this choice where NATO must decide to either accept that they've lost this proxy war or escalate. This may be why some Western leaders have resorted to escalatory statements regarding NATO intervention more directly into the conflict, perhaps believing NATO manpower and equipment can overcome Russian forces in a manner Ukrainian forces currently cannot. It may be that some Western leaders believe NATO forces creating a buffer zone in Western Ukraine might provide the Ukrainian population added impetus to further mobilize and fight in the East. While this might free up additional troops and make available additional manpower, it still will not solve the problem of properly training these forces, nor the problem of properly arming and equipping them. Those problems aren't going to go away, and these problems will take years to solve if and when the West decides to actually seriously solve them. Whether or not NATO intervention could achieve either of these goals, such courses of action would raise the threat of escalation and even the prospect of nuclear war. This would essentially mean NATO forces directly fighting Russian forces. Both NATO and Russia have nuclear weapons at their disposal. This would be very dangerous. The fact that NATO is considering such escalatory measures reflects the mindset beginning to take shape within Washington, London, and Brussels at this stage of the conflict. NATO leaders must ask themselves whether they are genuinely confident escalation at this juncture can resolve the problems created by their own poor planning and preparation up until now, or whether subsequent escalation will compound these problems further. And if I had to decide, I would say they're only going to make their problems much, much worse. Now, after writing this article, I stumbled across this paper. This is from 2017 from the U.S. Army War College Quarterly Parameters. It's titled Expanding Brigade Combat Teams. Is the training base adequate? It's by Colonel Esley T. Pitts. If you read his short biography, it says at the time of writing this paper, served as the Director of Training, Education, and Leader Development in the Office of the United States Security Coordinator at the U.S. Consulate in Jerusalem. He was commissioned as an armor officer in 1994. Pitts has held a variety of command and staff positions in the United States, Germany, and Iraq, including commander of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry at Fort Hood, Texas, and Task Force Senior Maneuver Trainer at the Joint Multinational Readiness Center in Germany. So he might know a thing or two about training large numbers of soldiers. The concept of this paper is exploring what would happen if the US suddenly had to start standing up new brigades, brigade combat teams. Again, these are units that are around 4,000 men strong. If you needed more brigade combat teams because you were fighting a large conflict, you needed more manpower, or you were already fighting a major conflict and losing large amounts of manpower, and you needed to reconstitute it as quickly as possible, how could you very quickly stand up additional brigade combat teams? That is what the paper is exploring. If you read through the whole paper, ultimately it says 30 months are needed to train a brigade combat team. And the purpose of the paper is discussing how this could be done quicker, but it also talks about the risks that come from doing so. 30 months is a long time. And if we think back to when NATO and Ukraine were trying to stand up brigades for the 2023 summer-fall offensive, they did it in much less than a single year. And what happened? What happened to those brigades when they launched the offensive? They were decimated. So that is one of the risks of trying to speed up the process of building new brigades: failure. We have seen across the Western media articles about how young Ukrainian unit commanders are, and they write articles as if this is a good thing, that it's young blood, fresh ideas. But in reality, the larger the military unit, the more experience a commander needs. You cannot just graduate someone up the ranks, promote them up the ranks to take these positions because their predecessor is dead, and you just have someone younger take their place. Maybe you do that out of necessity, but you would never do that if you had an alternative not to. As I read out parts from this paper, you're going to understand why Ukraine's idea of standing up these brigades so quickly, why that was a bad idea, why it failed, and why Ukraine really does not have any possible way of solving this problem. They really have no way of doing this. So the paper explains institutional training involves basic and specialized instruction for large cohorts of recruits and leaders. Under a section in the paper titled Training Brigades, it says, the Armor Training Brigade at the Maneuver Center of Excellence, Fort Benning, Georgia, conducts one station unit training for both tankers and scouts. The training lasts roughly 16 weeks for either skill and currently produces 1,440 tankers per year after 12.7% attrition and 2,340 scouts after 14.1% attrition. They're talking about how many people, what percentage of people who join the training program end up dropping out. Additional capacity added in the summer of 2017 should increase the total graduates per year to 1,920 tankers and 2,748 scouts. Given modest additional resources, the existing brigade infrastructure could support 3 additional companies to train such soldiers. The Infantry Training Brigade graduates 12,900 infantry per year after a typical attrition of 14%. With classes filled to normal capacity, the brigade could graduate 19,300 infantry per year. However, it could produce 21,000 graduates under surge conditions. Now, Ukraine is losing between 500 and 1,000 soldiers per day. Again, the Russian Ministry of Defense is putting the number at 400,000 since 2022. That means 200,000 a year. The U.S. is placing the number of dead Ukrainian soldiers at 70,000. That's 35,000 a year. So U.S. training using this model at maximum capacity would be incapable of replacing Ukrainian soldiers faster than Russia is removing them off the battlefield. And that is the United States training soldiers under ideal conditions with well-established infrastructure to do so. The article says newly formed brigades will not have the time or skills to train soldiers on many essential tasks, such as driver's licensing, job-specific skills, and combat lifesaver training, which are usually left to a new soldier's first unit. To form BCTs rapidly, brigade combat teams, one station unit training could be lengthened. Experienced instructors could be leveraged to conduct such training prior to soldiers arriving at newly formed brigade combat teams. One station unit training, to give you an idea of what that is, that's when they take a raw recruit, they go through basic training and training to become, say, a tanker or a scout, or some other role, all all at one go. They do not separate it into different schools. When I was in the US Marine Corps, I did 3 months of basic training, another about a month of Marine combat training, and then 9 months of specialized training for my military occupational specialty. So this is a slightly different way of doing it, just in case you didn't know what one station unit training was. If they extend one station unit training, it's going to be in order to give them the skills that they would normally learn when they arrived at a brigade. If they extend that, it's going to be longer than 3.5 months. So when you get a conscript or a volunteer, it'll be over 3.5 months. It could be 4, 5, even 6 months before you start receiving soldiers for your brigade. And just think about how Ukraine was trying to stand up entire brigades and send them off on an offensive in less than a year. Just think about how inadequate that was. Now we know why the offensive failed the way that it did. You have to remember, the US is talking about doing this under relatively ideal conditions. Think about how Ukraine would try to replicate this process under the conditions they face inside Ukraine. Then the paper starts talking about acquiring non-commissioned officers and officers needed to lead the various units that make up a brigade. It talks about how long it takes to produce NCOs and officers, and they say that it's possible to speed up the training of, say, an entry-level NCO, an NCO that might be leading a fire team. But as you start looking for NCOs to lead larger and larger units, you begin to see that there is really no way to speed up the experience required by an NCO to fill those positions. This paper talks about pulling NCOs from other places inside the army to help stand up these new brigades. Ukraine does not have that option. They don't have extra NCOs and officers floating around doing nothing at the moment that they can pull in to help build up new brigades. That is not an option for Ukraine. It talks about officers in particular. It could take 2 to 4 years to produce a new officer, and they say there really is no way of speeding that up. It says most new officers attend unit-specific training, such as the Army Reconnaissance Course, Bradley Leaders Course, Striker Leaders Course, Airborne School, Ranger School, or the Mortar Leader Course after completing the basic officer leadership course. Thus, training for a new infantry or armor officer lasts 9 to 12 months, and that's after they finish their initial several years of officer training. The higher up you go, in terms of officers that you need to lead various aspects of the brigade, the longer it's going to take to train these officers and for them to acquire the experience they need to properly, effectively fill those positions. And again, in the paper, they talk about pulling officers from elsewhere in the army to stand up these new brigades. Again, for Ukraine, that is not an option. You can promote soldiers up into positions that are vacant, but you will pay the consequences for that. They will be unqualified for their position. They will not be able to do their job effectively. Thus, the brigade will not fight on the battlefield effectively. Different units within the brigade must work together in combined arms warfare. I've explained this many times before. You have infantry, armor, artillery, many other different types of units that all have to work together to support each other on the battlefield. They cannot just go out and do their own thing. They need to be able to coordinate. The brigade commander needs to be able to command the different units and adjust them as fighting takes place. They need to be able to communicate with them, tell them to do tasks they're confident they can carry out on the battlefield. So once you get all of these soldiers into the brigade, they have to train together as a brigade. When the commander says to do something, they have to have trained many times in order to effectively fulfill the commanding officer's orders when he gives them. And so that the brigade must train together, and the paper explains that. It says a 37-week battalion training model that concentrates on combined arms maneuver in a contemporary operating environment and culminates in a combat training center exercise would enable newly formed armored brigade combat teams to achieve initial proficiency in brigade maneuver. Because the training progression would require 4 maneuver battalions to rotate through key training resources, particularly live fire ranges, a minimum of 40 weeks would be required to sequence all 4 units through the training. The following schedule for each battalion rotation also includes white space for retraining and equipment maintenance. The model does not provide for training in stability operations or other non-essential skills. That's 9 months, and that's after the 3.5 months of one station unit training, producing the basic entry-level soldiers that you need to fill up the brigade, and then another 9 months of the brigade training together to acquire basic proficiency. Then it starts to talk about the risks of speeding this process up. Although individual armored brigade combat teams can be built rapidly, there is risk in doing so. Primarily, the entire force would lack experience. Existing brigades would not only release many of their most experienced leaders, but would also acquire inexperienced replacements. New brigades would receive some experienced cadre, but many of the soldiers would likely be inexperienced in their new billets or ranks. And then again, when we're talking about Ukraine, almost all of them will be. The primary reason 30 months are required to build a brigade combat team is for experience. Currently, soldiers at the unit level average 5 years in service, while historically draftees and volunteers alike spent 2 years in service. Considering the increasingly complex battlefield and equipment, there is no replacement for experience. Nevertheless, this proposal would generate brigades with experience measured in months, not years. Then it talks about previous attempts by the US to expedite training. They talk about the Vietnam War, where they were speeding up training, cutting corners, and they talk about the problems that created. Junior leaders from the Vietnam War were mass produced to face the pressing needs of that war. They were not trained to be professional and long-serving leaders, but a short-term source of combat leadership. While they did lead well on the battlefield, they lacked the ability to provide mature leadership in garrison. The young sergeants in particular were trained to be good enough to win the war, but were given almost no instruction and discipline in garrison leadership. I'll point out that the US did not actually win the Vietnam War. I don't know what they're talking about there. Then it concludes, while it is mathematically possible to push the right numbers of soldiers through training, promote them, assign them a billet, and propel them through a modicum of training, they still lack the proficiency and lethality gained only through multiple iterations in diverse conditions associated with day and night operations in inclement weather and during chemical conditions. Failing to train soldiers for proficiency, particularly when combined with the performance of lower quality recruits, is disaster. Because they also talk about when you're speeding up training, when you need to stand up military units faster than usual, you have to accelerate recruitment or drafting or conscription, whatever you're using to find new soldiers. And in order to do that, you need to spread the net wider, which means lowering standards. You end up accepting almost anybody, but almost anybody ends up becoming very difficult to train. So looking at Ukraine's current manpower problems and what is actually unfolding on the battlefield, who can say that this is not exactly what is taking place right now? And how can you fix this problem? Because again, in the paper, they're talking about pulling NCOs and officers from elsewhere in the service. Where can Ukraine pull additional NCOs and officers? This is a problem that cannot be solved. Ukraine cannot solve it themselves. NATO cannot solve this problem. There is no way to speed this up. If it takes 30 months to stand up a new brigade, that's how long it takes. And if you cut corners and you end up with brigades like what Ukraine used in their offensive last year, then this isn't a solution. You don't have 30 months to build up new brigades. So what do? And that's why this becomes very dangerous, because the only options left, again, are NATO admitting that they've lost this proxy war against Russia, or NATO being tempted to intervene. And when you look at how badly NATO prepared for this conflict, all of their miscalculations up until now, the prospect of them considering intervention at this point is extremely dangerous. Until then, we have to keep a very close eye on this conflict to see in which direction the US and the rest of NATO go. At least now we have a fairly good understanding of how long it takes to actually build up a new brigade, and we can see why efforts to condense all of that training into under a year, why it ended so disastrously last year in Ukraine's offensive. I will continue keeping an eye on this conflict and looking deep into different aspects like this. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Check the video description for all of the links that I referenced, both in the article and in this explanation of building up new brigades. Also in the video description below are ways you could help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms, not YouTube or any other platform. If ads pop up, feel free to skip past them. They're not doing me any good. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee or through Patreon. To everyone who is helping out, whether it's one-time donations, donations month to month, or even if you're just sharing my work with others, you have no money to spare, but you're sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, all of that is greatly appreciated. So thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.